All right. We are on chapter 32. It's called The Worst Things to Say. If Pa didn't get him first, Virgil figured one of three things would happen. He could suffocate, starve, or die of thirst. He didn't know which one was worse. Maybe all of them would happen. Maybe he wouldn't be able to breathe and his tummy would rumble until it made his heart stop and his throat would close up, dry as a bone, and it would all happen at the same time. How much air was in an abandoned well anyway? Was there a limited supply? Would it eventually run out? Would Pa come back? An army of tears surged up from his gut. He squeezed his eyes shut to stop them from gushing out, then looked up, 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 trying to see if there were ways for air to get inside. But it was completely dark. If light couldn't get in, how would air ever make it? Doesn't matter much, said Virgil, since I'm gonna starve anyway. He fed Gulliver a dandelion. He couldn't see him, but he felt the tug of Gulliver's teeth against the stem and heard the faint munching as he chewed it down. I'm sorry, Gulliver, said Virgil. I got us into a big mess. What happened next was inevitable. It was bound to happen, even if Virgil didn't want it to. Honestly, it could happen to anyone. Virgil began to cry. The tears pushed up from somewhere deep in his belly, shifted into his throat, and dribbled out like water from a leaky faucet. He tried desperately to stop them. He hated crying. He hated how it made his face wet and his eyes puffy and his throat hurt, but there was no stopping it. The tears came harder and with ferocity until the faucet wasn't just leaking, it was pouring, and Virgil had to catch his breath between sobs. Maybe he was being weak, or a baby, or a frightened turtle. So what, though? He was afraid. He was trapped in a pit without a friend in the world, and he was afraid. He'd heard once that before you die, you see your life flash before your eyes. He wasn't exactly dying just yet, but a few flashes came anyway. He thought of Lola. He thought of her hands and how they felt like paper. He thought of all of her stories and how she'd complimented his fingers and said he should be a pianist, and how she taught him about Pa and the Stone Boy and the Sun Queen. Too bad she'd never told him a story about how to escape a well. Now she never would. He thought of his parents and brothers, the way they spoke in exclamation points and always teased him for being too shy, too quiet, and how they thought it was so silly that he was afraid of the dark. He thought of how he used to imagine that he'd be floating in a river like Moses and his mother just happened to find him. Maybe she picked him up and said, "What's this? A baby with no parents? I'll take him home straight away." Speaking in exclamation points as usual. And then he went home with her, and everyone realized quickly that he didn't exactly fit in. But that was okay, because they loved him anyway. And he loved them too. Of course, even if he didn't understand them. And now he never would. He thought of Valencia. He wiped his snotty nose with the back of his hands and then swiped them on his pants. Usually he wouldn't do such a thing, but the rules didn't matter now. He was suffocating in a land of lost opportunities where he should have talked to Valencia, told Lola that he loved her, tried to understand his parents and brothers, thanked Kaori for being such a good friend to him, and now it was too late for any of that. Pa would come eventually, he was certain. And even if Pa didn't come, snatching Gulliver as an appetizer before going after the main course, there was still no hope. Virgil took big, heaving breaths. He cried until the faucet ran dry. How would anyone find him? The bull was his only hope for rescue, and there was a fat chance of that happening. The bull had probably forgotten all about him already. Or maybe he was back in his devil's den, making a note in his log of evil deeds. First day of summer, trapped Virgil Salinas in a well. Virgil's cheeks ached, his eyes burned, his nose throbbed. Crying hurt. That's why he hated it so much. Crying is good for the soul, said Ruby softly. It means something needs to be released. And if you don't release the something, it just weighs you down until you can hardly move. There's nothing else for me to do, Virgil said. His voice was hoarse from the weeping. You should try yelling again. Virgil pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. What's the point? No one can hear me. Of all the questions you ever ask yourself in life, never ask what's the point. It's the worst question in the world, Ruby said. You sound like Lola. Good. I miss her. He said it quietly, embarrassed even in front of himself, but it needed to be said. When you say things out loud, you let them go. Lola had told him that once, but it didn't feel like it worked, because he still missed her. It's not like you're never going to see her again, said Ruby. How do you know? No one will ever find me. No one will ever save me. There's no chance. Bayani, of all the things you ever tell yourself in life, never say there's no chance. Okay. It's too late then, Ruby sighed. The sound traveled like a curl of invisible smoke. That's even worse, she said. Virgil slumped against the wall. He wanted to sleep through the starvation, but he couldn't. Not with Pa there somewhere. Maybe Pa was just above his head now, watching, waiting to swoop down, circling like a vulture. Virgil didn't dare to look up to see. It was too dark anyway, just as Pa liked it. Virgil held his breath. Was that a feather against his cheek? Was that a rustling? He put his hands over his ears. Try yelling for help again, said Ruby. I don't want to. It might what? Startle Pa from his invisible perch and send him down for us. I told you, he only grows if you're afraid of him, said Ruby. Ignore him. Just yell. Do it for me. Virgil dropped his hands, slowly. All was quiet. You can't just give up, said Ruby. There's a time when a person has to give up. That's just the truth. Give me an example, said Ruby. I'm too tired to give examples. Don't avoid the question just because you don't want to think of an answer. Virgil sighed. He thought for a moment. Okay, let's say you're running a race, and it's a really, really long race, and you sign up because you think you can do it, and you practice running for months, maybe even years, and then the big race comes, and you're running, and suddenly your legs are really tired, and you're dehydrating, and you can barely breathe, and the finish line is still way down the road and stuff, but you can't make it. You start throwing up or something, and if you keep going, you know you're just going to drop dead, so you stop. And you sit on the side of the road so you don't die. You have to give up, or else. That's a terrible example, said Ruby immediately. Virgil's eyebrows bunched together. He glared into the darkness. No, it's not. Yes, it is. What makes it a terrible example? Because the person in your story didn't give up. Giving up would have been never starting the race at all. Virgil sighed again. I want to sleep. Will you watch out for me? I will. If you yell for help one more time. Promise? I promise, Bayani. Make it a good one. Virgil took a big, deep breath. He filled his chest with air, opened his mouth wide, and yelled until his voice gave up. Let's do chapter 33. Tanaka and the Somerset. Did you hear that? Asked Kaori. She had her hands up, palms out, as if to say, everyone stop where you are. Jen's eyes widened and her face paled. She took a step closer to her big sister, then another. I heard it. What? What happened? Said Renee, looking from one girl to the other. It sounded like... Jen's eyes searched the woods, but she didn't move a muscle. Sounded like someone calling for help, said Kaori. Renee's eyebrows shot up. You mean you heard someone screaming? Are you sure? Yes, said the sisters, in unison. Kaori pointed westward. It came from over there, she said. Without saying another word, the three of them walked in that direction. A dozen images flipped through Kaori's mind. She imagined Virgil, curled up at the foot of a weeping willow, holding a broken leg. Virgil, perched on the highest branch of the tallest tree, trapped like a cat. Although she knew better, he would never climb a tree that high. Virgil, lying next to a rock with a bump on his head. She thought only of Virgil. She never imagined that after walking for 2 minutes, they would come across something else altogether. A strange boy she didn't recognize, sitting on the ground with his back against a pine tree and a white t-shirt wrapped around his beefy arm. When he saw them, his face changed from frightened and whiny to frightened and irritated. His eyes went from Kaori to Jen and then to Renee. When he saw her, he turned stoic and no longer seemed like the person who had cried out. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Clearly they knew each other. At least that's what Kaori's second sight told her at that moment. "Did you scream for help?" Renee said, sounding bored. The boy huffed and turned away. He brought his arm closer to his chest. The three girls knew immediately that he had, even though he snorted with an unconvincing "no." "What happened to your arm then?" said Jen, no longer ashen-faced. She motioned towards the makeshift bandage, which Kaori now realized was a pillowcase, not a shirt. "I got bitten by a snake, if you want to know." He sounded proud. "It was huge, like a cobra. It almost bit off my arm." "Really?" said Jen, mesmerized. "Yeah." His gaze swept all three of them. "I'm probably going to die if you don't get me to a hospital or something. I'm sure it was poisonous." Just Renee handed her bag to Jen and knelt next to him. The leaves shifted under her knees. She held out her hands and motioned for him to show her the wound, like a mother dealing with a spoiled child. "What are you going to do?" The boy jerked his arm away. "Hex me or something?" Just Renee made a big show of rolling her eyes. "I know a lot about snake bites, so show me your stupid arm." "No way!" Just Renee dropped her hands and shrugged. "All right. But you should probably know that you should keep that shirt or whatever wrapped around your arm like that. You're probably going to have to get your arm cut off. You're not supposed to cover the wound anyway." The boy snorted again. "You're crazy. You're always supposed to wrap up an injury. Everybody knows that." When you wrap up a snake bite, it makes the skin warm up and it traps the moisture. Moisture causes bacteria to grow. Then your arm gets infected. Then it spreads, and she made a chopping motion against her own arm. "That's why you're not supposed to wrap it up. Plus, I don't think it was poisonous anyway." "How do you know?" Jen asked. She seemed disappointed, like it was much more interesting to meet someone near death from a bite rather than a stupid boy infecting his own arm. Kaori observed everything with interest. Just Renee knew a lot about nature and animals. Maybe they should go into business together. Kaori could tell the fortunes and provide spiritual guidance, and Just Renee could help with spells or something. If Kaori needed a specific type of stone, Renee would know exactly where to find it. They could come up with a good name for their business, but not Kaori and Renee. That sounded lame. Something good, grown-up, and businesslike. Like their last names, Tanaka and... Kaori tapped Renee on the shoulder as the boy reluctantly lifted up his wrapped arm. Just Renee turned around to face her. "What's your last name?" Kaori asked. "Just curious." Just Renee paused and then said, "Somerset?" "Tanaka and Somerset." That sounded perfect, like a real business. She could see the sign now, bright and blazing. She could almost feel the flashing lights burning her eyes. Tanaka and Somerset. Tanaka and Somerset. When Just Renee tossed the pillowcase aside to expose the snake bite, Jen stepped forward and crouched next to them. "That's it," she said. "That's the big snake bite?" Kaori looked at the injury. She'd expected to see something much more heinous, too, like an enormous bump oozing pus and mucus, but the boy's arm was red, and that's it. They couldn't even see fang marks. "That's hardly anything," said Jen. "Of course not," the boy snapped. "When it bit me, I snatched it so hard with my other hand that it didn't even have time to make any more damage. I pried its fangs out of my arm. Then I wrung its neck and tossed the body down the well." Just Renee glanced up at Kaori like, "Yeah, right." "How do you know it's not poisonous?" Jen asked Just Renee. But Renee was looking at the boy's arm, not at Jen, so she didn't hear. "Hey," said the boy, moving his arm to get Renee's attention. She raised her eyes. Kaori suspected lasers would shoot out of them, if they could. "The stupid kid asked you something." Jen yanked her jump rope off her shoulder like a whip, only it didn't look very threatening, since it was hot pink and she'd put a happy face sticker on the handles. "What did you call me?" The boy ignored her and repeated Jen's question to Renee. He held his arm against his chest like it was a precious jewel. "Because this is barely a bite. You may as well have been stung by a wasp." Just Renee counted off on her fingers. "Your throat isn't closing up, you don't have a fever, you're not having a seizure, and you're sitting here talking to us like the usual dodo that you are. You probably got bitten by a water snake or a garter snake, or maybe even a northern racer or something." "Whatever, defo," he screamed off the ground, scrambled up. "How'd you manage to get bitten by a snake anyway?" Kaori said, trying to make her tone as condescending as possible. I was on a snake hunt practically all day, he said. That's what I do. I hunt snakes and kill them with my bare hands. He showed her his hands. Is that supposed to be impressive? Kaori said. Sounds like you're mentally defective. Just Renee stood too. You should go back to your cave and run warm water over that so-called injury. Then wash it with mild soap. You don't want to get infected or... She made the chopping motion again. And for the record, my name is Valencia, not Defo. I thought your name was Renee, said Jen, speaking for both of them. But Valencia had turned and was glaring at the snakebite victim as he walked away, so she didn't hear. Okay, that's the end of that chapter.